Hello and welcome to another White Dwarf walkthrough. Today we are casting our mind back to the heady days of February 1998 with White Dwarf 218. This was a pretty important White Dwarf for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because this was the first White Dwarf to feature a battle report involving the Necrons. And secondly, this was the White Dwarf from which the Tale of Four Gamers series originates. Join me and we'll take a little bit of a leaf through it. So, first thing we can see from this is that there's not one but three battle reports actually in this issue. There was a Warhammer Fantasy one, a 40k one, and a Digger Knob one. Yes, as the cover gives it away, this was the issue for the release of the supplement for Gorka Morka, Digger Knob. First thing we can see from the release section is that there was a whole bunch of new Necron models that came out in this issue. This was the second issue to feature Necron information. The previous issue had come with a White Dwarf 217, had come with a Necron model as a kind of a Christmas giveaway. But this issue had more kind of full release, including a Lord choice, included the Destroyer models, and essentially gave you the option to run a whole Necron army. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Beyond that, the other new releases we can see, there's a whole bunch of Chaos stuff that came out. Previous issue 217 again had featured the new Realm of Chaos book, which had rules for all of the different kind of Chaos armies for Warhammer Fantasy. And this issue saw the release of not just demons, minotaurs, beastmen, but also the plastic Chaos Warrior box set. And there's a whole really beautiful detailed spread where they go through all the different models that have been released, showcase some of the heavy metal painting of the time, and it includes one of my all-time favourite models, the Minotaur Lord model. Skipping past that, then we get into Digger Knob, a little bit more information about, as I say, who the diggers were and what was contained in the book. The Digger Knob book didn't just contain the rules for these puny oomy diggers, it also contained rules for the kind of mutated remnants of the human species that was left upon the planet, the muties, and the rebel grots, with the infamous Red Gobbo putting in his first appearance. There was also, much like the kind of Necromunda supplements that came out around that time, the Outlanders book, there was special characters, dramatis personae, and one of them actually features in the battle report, the first battle report in this book, which was Diggers versus the Morka mob that had been featured in White Dwarf's 214 and 215. Back in 214, when Gorka Morka released, they did a little article about how you could build your own mob, how you'd paint them up, and then in White Dwarf 215 they played through 3 games using that mob, building up some experience and letting it sort of collect some teeth from cashing in on some scrap that the gang had collected. In this issue then they feature that mob facing off against one of the new tribes from the Digger Knob supplement, and to balance the numbers a bit, they gave the Diggers one of the dramatis personae, Nazgrub Wurzag, who was a properly orky looking prospector model. I mean, absolutely their pickaxe folded up front of the hat. It looks like he should be going, "Stay off my claim," and all that. But yeah, I'm not going to spoil how the battle report turned out. If you want that, you'll have to go dig up your own copy of White Dwarf 218. But essentially, it's a very typical battle report. You've got maps, you've got a few in-game photos, and it actually finishes off with an article on how to paint your diggers, much like they'd done for the boys in the Gorka Morka release issue. Moving swiftly on then, we get to the aforementioned Necron army list. So this is full data sheets for the Necron Lord, the Necron Destroyers, and an army list to let you take your own Necron army. Necrons didn't have their own codex back then, and Games Workshop weren't shy about putting the rules for their new models in the issue so that you could have them and play with them straight from the off. And yeah, that's exactly what they did in the next battle report, which is pretty darn infamous in Warhammer history. This one's gone into several of the codices, it's in some of the Black Library novels, Caiaphas Cain references it in one of his books. It's the Massacre at Sanctuary 101. So this was a classic Last Stand type scenario of an example of all the different sister models they had available at the time. The sisters have Seraphim, Sisters of Battle, a Rhino, Immolator, and a Canoness, essentially showcasing all of the models that the sisters had available at that point in terms of nuns with guns. And they have to do a desperate last stand against all of the Necron models that had come out at the time in a much sort of outnumbering horde. And essentially the scenario that's printed here for you to play at home if you want to is to see how long the sisters can hold out. Can they hold the line long enough for an astropath to get a warning off to the wider Imperium? Or will the Necrons wipe them out to a sister before the Imperium can get warning of this terrible new threat that was awakening? And yeah, it's a really great battle report. It features some lovely kind of classic maps with arrows and explosion symbols swooping all over it. It's got some in-game photos. Again, I'm not going to spoil the eventual result for you, although interestingly they did refight this recently using the most recent Tale of Four Gamers crowd and two of their armies under Lyle Lowry's White Dwarf run. That's well worth a look if you haven't checked that issue out. What I think is quite cool from this is they reproduced the scenario that they invented for this game at the start of the article. And what I'd quite like to give a try is replaying this scenario essentially using similar forces but using the Ninth Ed rules. So in a future video, check that out. I'll throw a battle report video up and we'll see how it replays. After the Necrons and the sisters duke it out, there's a strange little teaser image, and I had no idea at the time what this referenced, but it was some interesting looking artwork that had strong overtones of kind of 2000 AD and some of the other comics that I was reading around that time. And there's a Chaos Warrior who kind of says, "For too long have I slumbered, for too long have I dreamed, and now I awaken, and such nightmares will I unfold before you. Nightmares of war and death and chaos, such as you cannot begin to imagine. Cover your eyes, mortals. Hide where you will, but be sure of this. I will find you, for there can be no escape from my tortured visions." Feels like there should be an evil laugh at the end of that. It's very kind of Tales of the Crypt Keeper. I didn't know what that referenced at the time, and I'm not going to tell you what it references at the moment unless you've already guessed. There is another page further in the issue which I'll do before we talk about that further. Because in part I cannot wait to get to the next bit, which was the Tale of Four Gamers. I'm hoping that anyone who is watching this video knows what the Tale of Four Gamers is, but just in case. There's been many imitators of this, and actually, if you haven't seen it, ArbitorIan and his friends did an amazing video series of this for my Oldhammer campaign weekend last year. Check their little video series out, it's brilliant. But this was a new idea at the time, a premise of getting four gamers together and having them collect an army, sort of a new army all at the same time, with set increments to be kind of bought and painted each month, and then a showdown at the end. This was the fat bloke, Paul Sawyer, from the studio, two guys called Richard and a guy called Roy, who all worked in different departments at Games Workshop, in mail order, in sales, in retail. But yeah, they picked four armies, and then they essentially had set amounts that they had to spend each month and paint up, and it's just really beautiful. So the first month, this first issue, they were all given £50 to spend, which at the time was a good starting amount for an army. It was the cost of the Warhammer Fantasy Starter Box, for example. Paul Sawyer went for the new Beastmen. This was a time when you could call up mail order and ask them about essentially pre-release miniatures, stuff that had had kind of samples cast up and that they had just knocking around in the mail order room, and you could ask if they had any going spare, and if they did, they would sell them to you in advance of their official release date, which is how he was able to get his hands on some of the new metal Beastmen models that were available then, including, as I say, one of my all-time favourite models, the Minotaur Lord. But yeah, he got a decent selection of Beastmen, some actual conversion bits as well. Back then you could mail order spare parts, because a lot of the miniatures were metal. You could punch in the parts code onto a form, fax it over or phone it over through to mail order, and then they would sell you essentially whatever random bits you needed to make your own unique model. He used that to make a Beast Lord with a bigger axe, a Beastman Champion with a nice big spear, and yeah, a bacon baguette with the spare change, because who doesn't like a bit of bacon in the morning? Roy Barber next, from the sales team, he went for the Lurking Skaven, and I think I quite like that. Whereas Paul Sawyer had a very definite approach to his army in terms of models he knew he wanted to include and a style of play that he wanted to emulate, Roy just seems to have gone for what is cool. So, I mean, his starting increment is a Warp Fire Thrower, a Jezzail, some Skaven, Clan Rat boxes, and Deathmaster Snitch, one of the special characters, who you absolutely can't imagine him using in those kind of early low points games, but he loved the model, and rule of cool meant he went with it. Compare that then to Richard Gunson, who was one of their retail guys, who went with the Loyal Knights of Bretonia, who not only had a clear plan in mind and a vision in terms of kind of the narrative that he wanted to build for his army, but took advantage of one of the store opening deals that they had back then. Whenever it was a new store opened or a store was renovated, they would do one of these grand openings where you could get things like box sets and blister packs on 3 for 2. So he was able to stretch his £50 to £78. And got himself 2 big blocks of archers, a sorceress, a nice large chunk of knights errant, and a unit of mounted squires. A pretty decent starting army, to be honest. Final up, and a very different approach again, Richard Hobson, one of the mail order trolls. He went for a fully planned out army list, first of all. So he worked out his full 2,000 points list in terms of what he would like to collect over the course of the whole series, and then bought items off of that so that he could build his army in increments with a fixed goal at the end. I think that's one of the things that's quite cool about the Tale of Four Gamers series, is it showcases different ways that you can go about collecting an army, whether it's just, ooh, shiny, I like that model, magpie style, or it's a methodically planned out and pre-written army list, or if it's a narrative approach, trying to build the story behind your army. More about the Tale of Four Gamers at the end of this video, so stay tuned to the end, please. Next up, Golden Demon 1997. So this was from Games Day 97, which I didn't make it to, and I really wish I had. There's some beautiful models photographed here. I'm just going to quickly throw some of those up on the screen. 2 cool things from this. There was a poster of all of this that came free with this issue of White Dwarf, which I had up on my bedroom wall for a couple of years after this. There was a beautifully painted Bretonian command group that took silver that year. It's got some lovely conversion work, a beautiful hand-painted banner, and it was painted by a guy called Chris Blair, who I'm actually now mates with. And it was one of those weird things of seeing something as a kid and then randomly ending up becoming friends with the guy years later through the hobby. One of those nice things, I guess, about having a shared pastime. You meet people of a similar mindset. Chris is still painting, and you can find him on Instagram at GrumpyPaintingGit, and I'll put the link in the description below. Check out his stuff. He's got some showcases of some of his other Golden Demon winning miniatures and what he's working on at the moment, including a new Blood Bowl team he's painted up. Moving on then, after the Golden Demon section, there was another thing that featured from Games Day 1997. This had been teased a little bit in White Dwarf 217. So in White Dwarf 217, they had released a box set of the Praetorian Imperial Guard, and this was essentially a variant sculpt of the Metal Mordian Imperial Guard, except they'd replaced their kind of little peaked caps with pith helmets, and they'd gone full kind of Zulu with that approach. This issue revealed that actually that group had been part of a massive mega display that had been painted up for Games Day 97 by stores up and down the country, and in fact around the world, displaying this huge battle between massed regiments of Imperial Guard and swarms, literally a full-on orc war, complete with a gargant coming out of a fortress. And from that's where we first see the Praetorian Imperial Guard making a last stand on the ridgetop. But it also featured things like some of the guys from Spain had converted and painted up these funky orc fighter bomber models that previously had only featured in Epic. But very shortly thereafter would make an appearance through Forge World. Another guy from the Canada store had made a completely scratch-built Baneblade. Again, something that had featured in the Epic 40,000 range, but hadn't yet appeared in 40k, and wouldn't until Forge World made their own about a year later. And then there's a nice piece for Epic 40,000 where they essentially printed army lists to suggest historic forces that would let you refight some of the sort of classic moments from 40k history. So, for example, the attack on the Yanden Craft World by the High Fleet Kraken, Battle of Miral Prime, where the Sides of the Emperor chapter finally met their end. Jarvis gets a look in with his semi-regular feature, the J-Files. This piece was a nice one on different ways that you can run linked games, and I think this is something that perhaps has influenced the way I approach running campaign weekends and events down the years. He showcased one option, which was having essentially a larger battle spread over multiple tables, and the different tables being able to move between the different forces being able to move between each table, and each table being able to affect the other. And another approach, considering the same approach but on a map-based scale, where you might imagine that each table is a different portion of a larger map, with progress being made around and about kind of the kingdom. In this case, the example it gives is the Forest of Lorien and parts of the Grey Mountains. Next page then, a further teaser for that comic book art that I'd mentioned before, this time with a Space Marine giving an inspirational speech. This, of course, was the teaser for Warhammer Monthly that would release the following month. And this was a as it may sound, a monthly comic book that was published by Games Workshop well before any of the deals that they struck with Marvel or Dynamite or any of the other kind of big name comic series. And it's one I've got almost the full run of Warhammer Monthly. It was a great showcase for some of the writers who came to be big names in Black Library, but it was also just an origin really for some of the notable characters who've since become part of Warhammer lore. Cal Jericho first got his appearance in the pages of Warhammer Monthly. Ephriel Stern got her first appearance in the pages of Warhammer Monthly. And there are a number of characters who also featured in that comic that made appearances in some of the Black Library novels as well. I'll do a full video talking in more detail about Warhammer Monthly and some of the great story arcs that ran in that at a future point. But yeah, comment below, let me know what your favourite character was from Warhammer Monthly. Final battle report then, and this was not your standard pitched battle report that they'd done before, but rather they decided to do a flank attack battle from the Battles book, and so it was a good way to showcase the new Chaos Demon models that had been released by having them take on some of the forces of the High Elves, who had essentially two armies, an army split in half, 1,600 points of a kind of a holding force, and then nearly 1,400 points of the flanking force that was made up of kind of hard-hitting and fast-moving units. Arrayed against that was a mob of demonettes led by Demon Prince of Slaanesh, and a whole bunch of horrors led by one of the relatively new Lord of Change models. And again, lots of beautiful pictures of kind of a great heavy metal army in mid-flow, interspersed with those really nice classic maps with swooping arrows and little boxes moving around and about on them, which I dearly miss seeing in battle reports these days. Again, I'm not going to tell you who won. You can check that out for yourself. The issue finishes off with the as expected parts section at the back, where it details some of the codes if you want to mail order any of the bits for models that were featured or released in this issue. That's pretty handy for us, and it's also pretty handy that this issue coincided with the second issue of Troll magazine, something that had started being given away anytime you mail ordered something like some of those parts bits that are featured at the back of the issue, or if you got your White Dwarf subscription. I say it's handy because this gives us a peek into the prices and the deals that were available at that time in terms of the way that stuff cost back in 1998. And that's handy for me because of the announcement that I'm making here is I'm so inspired by what is featured in the Tale of Four Gamers series here and by the Tale of Four Gamers series that ArbitorIan ran. I'm going to be doing my own Tale of Four Gamers video series with 3 friends, and what we're going to try and do is, as close as possible, recreate the experience of the Tale of Four Gamers from this sort of 1998 run of White Dwarfs. So to that end, we're all going to do the same 4 forces that featured in Tale of Four Gamers. I am taking the Noble Knights of Bretonnia, and I have already started painting. I know it's a little bit naughty, but I could not resist slapping paint to brush on these models because they're just so nice. One of my friends, Murray, who has featured much acrimony from my Silent War video series, is taking the Wood Elves. Mike, another of our Silent War gamers, is taking the forces of the nefarious Skaven. and Willard, who came so close to winning the Oldhammer campaign weekend this year, if you've seen the battle report video from earlier this year, is taking the Dark Forces of the Beastmen. We're going to do it in terms of the first month, we will get £50 to spend, and then each month thereafter, £25 to spend until we have spent the equivalent of £150. That will hopefully give us roughly 2,000 point armies that we can use at my next Oldhammer event, and we can also hopefully play through the one-day Tale of Four Gamers tournament that features in one of the future issues. £50 and £25 doesn't get you much at GW current prices though. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use my stack of Troll magazines, the old issues of White Dwarf that I've got, and some of the mail order posters that they released at the time, to buy our armies, but at 1990s prices. So £50, as it would have been spent in 1998. Stay tuned and check out our next video to see how we're all going to go about building our armies. For now though, thanks for watching.